And with that, hi and welcome back on my YouTube channel to this brand new video. In this video, I want to give you some tips and tricks when planning a KNX installation, and therefore I want to start with the fundamental thing of a KNX installation, this being the topology. So just as a quick reminder, a topology can consist of multiple areas, so 1 to 15 areas, and each area can consist of 1 to 15 lines. So if we take a look at such an area, here we can see that each area has 1 to 15 lines. So when we use multiple lines, we connect it via such an area. And then in addition to the normal lines, each area also has a main line being on top of it. So here you can see that we have line 1 to 15, each connected to a line coupler, and the line coupler is then on the upper side connected to the main line. And because those galvanically isolate both parts from each other, so each line coupler, because of that, the main line also needs an additional power supply. And that's basically how we can connect multiple lines together in an area. And now the bigger picture is this. Here we have multiple areas connected via the backbone and via area couplers. But the key thing still stays the same. We have 1 to 15 lines, 1 to 15 areas, and we connect it via couplers. Now, how does it look like in a normal one-family home? Well, there it's pretty straightforward, because in such a building we normally don't have that many devices. If we take a look at such a line consists of a power supply and then all the KNX devices directly connected to it via the twisted pair. And in this case we can connect up to 255 devices additionally to the line coupler or IP router. So that's normally fully sufficient for such an one-family home, isn't it? Well, basically that's true. So if we take a look at such a one-family home, now of course it's a little bit compromised, but here we can see we have a power supply, we have some actuators, some sensors in the inside, and also some sensors on the outside. So fully sufficient, simply using one line, and that's it, or? Well, that's not fully true, because even in this small case, it can make sense to split up this one line into multiple lines. Why that? Well, the first thing that you should consider is, here in this case, we have devices on the outside, so that are publicly available. So an attacker, intruder, or hacker could come and connect to this outside device, so for example to the push button sensor, and he could start to reprogram the installation, to send telegrams, so to manipulate the KNX installation. Now of course you always have to consider how high the risk really is. So if we take a look at this example, the one family home, I don't think that the weather station is such a big of a risk, because I think an intruder would have easier ways to get inside of the building. Even the push button sensor, I don't think that's that much of a risk. However, it is something that you should consider. And even in bigger buildings, so offices, public buildings, etc., where you have public available KNX devices, you should consider this. So that's one case. But another case also is true because of the outside devices. As we have devices sitting on the outside, those have a higher risk of failing. So for example, with humidity getting into the device and shortening the KNX wires. Now in this case, if we only have one big line with all the devices connected to it, well then, my whole KNX installation stops working. And because of that, I'm a big fan of differentiating between an inside line and an outside line. So what I would do in this case is pretty straightforward. I would use one line with an own power supply for the inside devices, so all the actuators, push button sensors, etc. And then I would install a second line with an additional power supply for the outside devices like the weather station, the push button sensor, etc. And then you can connect it via, for example, here in this case, 2 IP routers. And now if a device on the outside fails, so for example, humidity gets into the push button sensor, then only the outside devices are affected by it and the inside devices still work. Now, of course, you could also do it with line couplers here in this case. That depends on how you want to set it up. But that's basically what you should consider for such an installation. So if you have outside devices, it maybe makes sense to sit them on a second line. Now, okay, that's for a one-family home, but what's with bigger buildings? Now, this could look like the following. Here we have multiple flats, and each flat has its own KNX installation. So we can see we have the line 1.1 for the flat in the ground floor, the line 1.2 for the first floor, 1.3 for the second floor, and so on and so forth. And we also have devices in the staircase as well as the weather station, so I will call them common devices that are used basically by everyone. Now here you have multiple options on how you can connect these devices or these lines with each other. The easiest way is by simply using line couplers. So here in this case you would go ahead and use the common devices as the main line and connect it to this main line via line couplers. You have all the lines in the flats. This is one solution. Now here in this case what you should consider is that when, for example, the weather station shortens the circuit because of humidity or something else, that then the main line, so line 1.0, well, is cut short and won't work any longer. However, the lines in every flat still will work. But what won't work is the communication between those lines in the flats. So if a device in the flat in the ground floor want to communicate to a device in the second floor, this will no longer work if the line 1.0 is affected by a shortened circuit, etc. A solution to that could be the following. Here in this case you could use, for example, KNX IP routers instead. So what you would do is that the devices on the staircase and the weather station are no longer on the main line, so line 1.0, but they are on their own normal line, so line 1.4. And then in each line you will have a KNX IP router and connect those lines via network. Now here in this case, if the line 1.4 fails due to a shortened circuit, well then each line in the flats will still work and also the communication between, because in this case it's done via the network. And what I would do also in this case is that you would use KNX IP secure routers to also have a secure communication on the IP side, which I think is pretty important. Now if you still want this behavior so that the common devices don't affect the communication between the other lines, and you don't want to use the network, you could also use line couplers instead. Now here in this case you would need to install an additional power supply so that you have the main line, here in this case, that is simply connecting all those lines together and no more devices are connected to it. So the devices in the staircase and weather station are still on their own line. This, of course, is also a solution. Now we saw two ways of connecting multiple lines together: line couplers and KNX IP routers. But what should you use? Well, first of all, this fully depends on the project that you have. For example, if a network installation is no option in between those flats, well, then your only solution is to use line couplers. However, I'm personally a fan of KNX IP and KNX IP routers. The price difference nowadays isn't that big, and if you use line couplers you have to consider that you also need an additional power supply, etc. So I think that's pretty straightened up the prices between those two solutions. But the benefit of using KNX IP routers is that you can also use it to program devices, and you can use it to connect KNX IP devices to your installation, like for example Node-RED or Home Assistant. So as you can see here in this example, we have two KNX twisted pair lines, each connected with a KNX IP router. And now if you want to connect Home Assistant or Node-RED, we simply connect it to the network, and then Node-RED can communicate to our KNX installation via KNX IP. And the IP routers then have their filter table and will only let those messages through that are needed in their line, which they know due to the EDS. So here in this case, the first telegram is being sent to the first line and the second IP router blocks it. If we, however, here in this case used line couplers to connect those two lines together and wanted to use, for example, Home Assistant, well then first of all you see we need an additional power supply and now also a KNX IP interface. And now here in this case, Home Assistant will send a telegram through the tunneling connection of the interface and then onto the twisted pair side. Now, if you want to know more between the difference of KNX IP routing and KNX IP interface, just let me know down in the comment section below. Maybe I can do an additional video on that topic. But that's basically the difference between those two, and my personal opinion is that I'm a big fan of KNX IP routers. So that was a lot of information about the topology. By the way, if you want to know more about KNX and, for example, also Home Assistant and KNX, then I recommend you to check out my video courses over on Udemy. There I have a dedicated video course on the topic of the EDS and KNX, so starting by the basics all the way to more complicated topics, and also a separate video course about connecting Home Assistant to KNX. So you would really support me by enrolling into one of those courses. If you are interested into it, I have linked you to coupon codes to the video courses so that you can get them a little bit cheaper. I would be more than happy to welcome you in one or both of those video courses. Now, that was, let's say, the physical structure of the KNX installation. But there's still the, let's say, digital structure. And what comes in mind there is, first of all, the physical address. So each device gets its physical address, like for example in a network with the IP address. And now here's the question, does it make sense to structure these physical addresses? And here my personal opinion is yes, but I don't think that it's really that necessary. So obviously it's good if you structure it, for example, that you say all the devices inside of a switching cabinet, so actuators, system devices, etc., they are in the block of physical addresses 1 to 100, and all the devices sitting on the outside are at the block 101 to 200, and all additional devices then are on 200 and above. So this is some structure that I would use. However, if you want to structure your physical addresses, my personal opinion is, or my personal recommendation is, that you make the blocks that you use big enough so that you have a big reserve if there come additional devices to one of those blocks. But in my opinion, nothing is more confusing than having a structure that later on you'll have to ignore because you don't have that much of space. So as I said, my recommendation, if you use so blocks for each device types, then make them big enough. One thing that's, in my opinion, more important than structuring your physical addresses is the group address. And there, my personal opinion is that you use a 3-digit group address and not the 2-digit group addresses, because with that you can sort them much more easily. Now, for small projects, it might be useful to use the 2-digit group address, but I personally only use 3-digit group addresses, etc. But how can you structure this group address now? Well, first of all, what you should bear in mind is that this 3-digit group address consists of 3 digits, but not all of them have the same size. And now there are multiple ways on how you can structure your group addresses, and there's definitely not one solution for every project. So like for the topology, also the structure of your group addresses fully depends on the project that you have. Now I want to show you, however, 2 solutions that you could use. Now one option could be the following, that on the main group you have the trade, so let's say lighting, blind, heating, etc. In the middle group you have the function, so for example in the case of the trade light you have the functions switching, dimming, dimming value, feedback, dimming value, etc. And then on the last address or last stage on the subgroup you have the exact location, so that then you have all your light group addresses in the main group 100, all for switching in 10, and then you would have the different locations, so for example kitchen spots, kitchen ceiling, etc. First of all, that's definitely a good solution to sort your group addresses. However, there are also some, let's say negative things about it. So for example, if you want to work quickly, for example, in visualizations or when you set up your devices, then normally the auto-completion always goes to the next group address, but in the subgroup. So if you connect it to 100, go to the next function or object that you want to connect, then the auto-completion goes to 101. So that's sort of, let's say, a small problem, but when you work quickly, that's definitely something that you should consider. And therefore there's another solution, and in this solution on the main group you now have the trades, or you still have the trades. Then in the middle group you have the location or the floor, so for example subfloor, ground floor, etc. That's fully depending on the project size, if this floors or rooms, etc. And then you have the correct location and subfunction in the group address. So you would start, for example, with kitchen switching, kitchen dimming value, feedback, etc. So here in this solution you have sort of group address blocks for each function in the subgroup. So what I mean with that is that, for example, for every light function you have a block of 5 group addresses. So you start with 100 for the kitchen, and then you have 5 group addresses that are all for this specific function, so light in the kitchen. And when you have the next light, well, then it starts with 106, 7, 8, 9, 10, and so on and so forth. And if you take a look, for example, at the planning guide of the KNX Swiss, unfortunately that's only in German available. There you can see these predefined blocks, or how many group addresses you should consider to it. So here you can see we have the middle group 0, and then a block consisting of 5 group addresses for lighting. Here we have the same thing for the blinds. However, here in this case each block has 10 group addresses, and so on and so forth. So that's definitely something I would consider taking a look at. I mean, there are a lot of translation services that you can use therefore. I have linked it down below in the description. So that's, I would say, the 2 variants that I used most of the times, or that I see a lot of in different projects. I personally have switched from the first style that I showed you to now this style where I have those predefined blocks, because when I work, for example, in Home Assistant or with the auto-completion inside of the ETS, that's for me a little bit quicker. However, both are definitely a good solution. However, it's not only the structure of your group addresses that is important, it's also the naming of them. So if you take a look at it here, that's also something that you can see in the guide of the KNX Swiss. We have the group address 100. And this group address is for switching the ceiling light in the kitchen in the ground floor. So what you could do, for example, is that you start first of all with the trade. So here in this case, light or light dimmable, blind, heating, etc. So here in this case I have a dimmable light and therefore start with LD. Then underline, then the room, so for example ground floor kitchen. Then either, let's say, a number or a specific description which light it is. So sometimes in the plans you have numbers for each switchable light. Here in this case I simply call it ceiling. And then the subfunction in this case being on-off. Therefore I simply call it O/O, so on/off. So if I would have the subfunction dimming, for example, it would end with underline D, dimming value with D value, feedback, for example, with FB, etc. So that's a solution on how you could name your group addresses so that you can directly see what's the purpose of this group address. So with the filter functions and search functions inside of the EDS, you can quickly find the correct group address that you need. But let's now come to a conclusion, because I think the video is already pretty long with a lot of informations. First of all, it's important for me to say that that's not the one guide on how you should do your KNX installation or set up your KNX installation. I just wanted to show you how you can do it. But you can definitely also do it other ways. So if you are of the opinion that I have forgotten something, then also let me know down in the comment section below. Let us quickly summarize. So for the topology we have said, what we need to take a look at is how many lines do we need. Especially, for example, if we want to differentiate between outside and inside lines. If we have multiple lines, we also have to consider on how we want to connect it, either via line couplers or with KNX IP routers. My personal opinion being, I'm a fan of KNX IP routers, and if you use them, I would definitely use secure routers. When it came to the physical addresses, my personal opinion is that, yeah, it can make sense to group them in, let's say, sort of number blocks. However, I don't think that it's that necessary, and if you want to group those numbers, then make those groups big enough so that you have enough space if more devices come to your installation. And then the big topic was the group addresses. There I showed you two styles. What I want you to know is that there's not that one style of group addresses that applies to all the projects. There are different ways of sorting your group addresses, and all of them have their pros and cons. However, if you structure it, you should remember that you have limitations. So the main group, middle group and subgroup are not unlimited, but they are limited to a certain number. And then the last thing was that you should also consider not only structuring your group addresses with the numbers, but also with the name. And there, my suggestion was, take a look at the KNX Swiss guide. So that's it for this video. I hope that it was helpful for you. If so, consider a like on this video. And also don't forget to subscribe to the channel to get informed for new videos. And with that, bye bye, and I see you in the next video.